On February 26, 2022, no bombs fell on Moscow. No troops crossed the border, no missiles were fired, but in the space of 72 hours, the Russian ruble lost 30% of its value. The Moscow Stock Exchange didn't open for weeks, Russian banks were frozen out of global markets. Ordinary Russians lined up around the block at ATMs, pulling out whatever cash they could before the system locked them out entirely. The weapon that did this had no warhead. It was a messaging network, built in a small Belgian town, run by a board of bankers, and almost nobody outside the financial world had heard of it. It's called SWIFT. And the day Russia was cut off from it, the world got its first clear look at the most powerful financial weapon ever built, and who controls it. To understand SWIFT, you have to understand a problem that existed before it. In the 1960s, international banking was chaos. Banks communicated by telex, essentially a glorified telegram. Every international transaction required a paper trail, manual verification, and a phone call to confirm it wasn't fraud. A single wire transfer between New York and Tokyo could take days, sometimes weeks. Banks kept getting the details wrong. Money disappeared into the gaps between systems. The global economy was growing faster than the pipes could carry it. So in 1973, 239 banks from 15 countries got together in Brussels and built a solution. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, SWIFT. The idea was simple: create one universal language for money, a standardized messaging system that every bank in the world could plug into. When Bank A in London wants to send money to Bank B in Singapore, SWIFT carries the message. It doesn't move the money itself. That's a common misconception. It moves the instructions. Think of it as the postal service for global finance. The money is the package. SWIFT is the address system, the routing network, and the delivery confirmation all in one. By 1977, it processed its first live transaction. By 1980, it was handling 1 million messages a day. Today, SWIFT connects over 11,000 financial institutions across more than 200 countries. Every day, it carries more than 40 million messages. The transactions those messages represent total over $5 trillion every single day. Almost every international payment on Earth flows through it. When you wire money abroad, SWIFT. When a company pays an overseas supplier, SWIFT. When a government buys oil from another country, SWIFT. When a central bank moves reserves, SWIFT. It is, quietly and completely, the circulatory system of the global economy. And for 50 years, almost no one thought about what would happen if someone turned it off. SWIFT was designed to be neutral. That was the whole point. It was built as a cooperative, owned collectively by the banks that use it. No single country controls it. It's headquartered in Belgium, governed by an international board, and its founding documents explicitly describe it as a neutral financial utility. For most of its history, that neutrality held. Then came September 11th, 2001. In the weeks after the attacks, the U.S. Treasury Department came to SWIFT with a request. Share transaction data. Help us track terrorist financing. Help us follow the money. SWIFT complied. Quietly, under a program called the Terrorist Finance Tracking Program, the U.S. government gained access to SWIFT data, so without the knowledge of most member countries, without a public vote, without a court order under international law. It ran in secret for 5 years before a newspaper broke the story. When it became public, European governments were furious. The Belgian parliament launched an investigation. SWIFT, they said, had violated European privacy law. But here's what that moment revealed. SWIFT wasn't just a neutral utility. It was a utility with a headquarters in Belgium, but servers in the United States. And that meant it was subject to U.S. law, American subpoenas, American pressure, American decisions about who gets access and who doesn't. The neutrality was real until Washington decided it wasn't. And once Washington understood what it had, everything changed. The first test came in 2012. Iran had been building toward nuclear capability for years. Sanctions had been piling up. Travel bans, asset freezes, arms embargoes. But Iran's oil kept selling. Its banks kept functioning. The sanctions were painful. They weren't crippling. Then the United States and European Union made a decision that had never been made before. They cut Iran off from SWIFT. Not a few Iranian banks, not a few transactions. The entire country, every Iranian bank, every Iranian financial institution, disconnected from the global messaging network overnight. The effect was immediate and brutal. Iranian oil exports dropped by more than half within months, not because buyers didn't want the oil, because there was no mechanism to pay for it. You can't move billions of dollars in oil revenue without a way to send the wire instructions. Without SWIFT, the money had nowhere to go. Iran's currency, the rial, collapsed. Inflation spiraled. Ordinary Iranians who had nothing to do with nuclear policy found their savings dissolving. The country hadn't been bombed. No navy had blockaded its ports. A messaging network had been switched off. And an economy was suffocating. The lesson was noted in every capital on earth. SWIFT was not a neutral utility. SWIFT was a weapon. The most precise financial weapon ever created. No civilian casualties. No destroyed infrastructure. No images on the news of buildings burning. Just a switch. And silence. For years, Russia watched what happened to Iran and drew its own conclusions. Moscow began building alternatives, a domestic messaging system called SPFS, agreements with China to settle energy payments in yuan. Reserves shifted away from dollars. They saw the door. They tried to build a different exit. It wasn't enough. On February 26, 2022, 2 days after Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine, the US, EU, UK, and Canada announced that major Russian banks would be removed from SWIFT. 7 banks on day 1. More to follow. The ruble went into freefall. The Moscow exchange halted trading. Russian companies with dollar-denominated debt had no mechanism to make payments. Foreign investors with money trapped inside Russia had no way to get it out. Russia's finance minister called it a financial thermonuclear weapon. He wasn't being dramatic. Within weeks, Russia's economy had absorbed a shock that years of conventional sanctions had failed to deliver. Not because the war was going badly, not because of military pressure, because 40 million messages a day had stopped arriving. But here is where the story gets complicated. Europe gets roughly 40% of its natural gas from Russia, and gas contracts are settled in, you guessed it, dollars, through SWIFT-connected banks. Cutting Russia off entirely meant Europe couldn't pay for the energy keeping its homes warm and its factories running. So the SWIFT cut was partial, selective, surgical. Certain Russian banks, the ones processing energy payments, were left connected. Gazprom Bank, the institution handling gas revenues, stayed on the network. The weapon was powerful enough to cripple, but the world was too interconnected to cut the cord completely. And that tension between using the weapon and being burned by it is the real story. After Russia, something shifted. Countries that had never thought seriously about SWIFT's dependence started thinking about it very seriously. China had already been building its alternative, CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, launched in 2015 after watching what happened to Iran. By 2023, it was processing over $12 trillion in annual transactions. Significant, but still a fraction of SWIFT's volume. India began settling oil trades with Russia in rupees, bypassing dollars entirely. Brazil and China started discussing yuan-denominated trade. Saudi Arabia, America's closest Gulf ally for 50 years, opened conversations about pricing oil in currencies other than the dollar. None of these alternatives are close to replacing SWIFT. Not yet. But the intent is clear. The world watched America turn a financial utility into a weapon. Twice. And the countries that weren't America started asking themselves a very uncomfortable question. If it happened to Iran, if it happened to Russia, what would it take for it to happen to us? That question is now driving the most significant restructuring of the global financial system since Bretton Woods in 1944. Not because SWIFT is failing, but because the countries that depend on it most have realized that depending on it completely is a vulnerability they cannot afford. Here's what the SWIFT story actually is. It isn't a story about banking. It isn't a story about sanctions. It's a story about how the world's financial plumbing was built by one generation in good faith for efficiency, and then discovered 50 years later to be the most powerful coercive instrument any nation has ever held. No country voted to give America this power. It accumulated quietly over decades as the dollar became the world's reserve currency and American banks became the backbone of global finance. The SWIFT lever exists because the world built its economy around American financial infrastructure. And now, slowly, deliberately, and with enormous difficulty, it is trying to build around it. The countries working hardest on alternatives are not rogue states. They are India, Brazil, China, Saudi Arabia, countries with half the world's population, countries that have watched the last decade and decided that a financial system with one hand on the off switch is a system they can no longer fully trust. Whether they succeed is a different question. SWIFT, still carries 40 million messages a day. The dollar still settles the majority of global trade. The alternatives are fragmented and incomplete. The door is still the same door. But for the first time in 50 years, serious people in serious governments are asking whether the world needs a different one. And the fact that the question is being asked at all is the most important financial story of our time. Because when the plumbing changes, when the pipes that carry money get rerouted, everything built on top of them changes too. Your savings, your investments, the price of oil, the value of the dollar in your pocket. The Strait of Hormuz is a physical door. SWIFT is a digital one. And it turns out the digital door is far easier to close.